The sound that broke the Tuesday morning silence wasn't a lawnmower or a leaf blower. In Maple Creek Estates, those were the only two sounds officially sanctioned before noon. No, this was a deeper, more primal noise. It was the percussive, chest-thumping whump-whump-whump of a twin-engine medical helicopter, and it was getting very, very close. Down on Cobblestone Court, my neighbor Brenda stood next to her golf cart. Her face, usually a mask of smug authority, was a Picasso painting of shock and horror. Her perfectly coiffed hair was being whipped into a frenzy by the rotor wash, and a flurry of HOA violation notices she'd been clutching took flight like a flock of angry, bureaucratic pigeons. The helicopter, a glorious crimson and white angel of mercy, was descending with terrifying precision onto the manicured grass island in the center of our cul-de-sac. Standing on my own perfectly compliant lawn, I gave the pilot a little two-finger salute. But to understand how a state-of-the-art Bell 429 medevac chopper ended up parked on Mrs. Gable's prize-winning petunias, you need to understand Maple Creek Estates. And to understand Maple Creek, you need to understand the beige tyranny of its queen. 6 months ago, I was a different man. I was the co-founder and lead coder for a soul-crushingly successful data logistics firm. My life was a blur of venture capital meetings, 100-hour work weeks, and a diet that consisted primarily of lukewarm coffee and corporate-branded granola bars. Then we got acquired. The number in my bank account suddenly had a lot more zeros, and I developed a severe allergy to the word synergy. I cashed out, ghosted Silicon Valley, and went searching for the exact opposite of my life. I went searching for boring. I found it in Maple Creek Estates. On paper, it was paradise. A pristine, planned community in a quiet corner of the state where the biggest news story was the annual bake sale. The houses were all large, handsome, and painted in one of 5 pre-approved shades of beige. The lawns were green, the streets were clean, and the silence was thick enough to chew on. It was perfect. I bought a lovely 2-story colonial with a welcoming front porch and a backyard that begged for a high-end gas grill. I was ready to embrace my new life as a quiet, unassuming suburbanite. My goal was to achieve a level of zen so profound that my biggest decision of the day would be charcoal versus propane. I had not, however, accounted for the homeowners association. And I certainly hadn't accounted for Brenda. The first hint of trouble arrived via certified mail. It was a crisp envelope with the Maple Creek HOA logo embossed in gold. Inside, a letter informed me that I was in violation of Bylaw 1138C, waste receptacle visibility. Apparently, on Tuesday morning, I had left my garbage can at the curb for a full 95 minutes after the truck had passed. A shocking 35 minutes over the legally allotted 60. The letter included a grainy photograph of my offending trash can, taken from across the street as if it were a high-value target under surveillance. I was fined $25. A week later, another letter. This one was for my garden gnome. I'd bought it on a whim. It was a cheerful little fellow holding a fishing rod. He was in violation of Article 7, Section D, Lawn Ornament and Accessory Aesthetics. My gnome, the letter coldly stated, was aesthetically discordant with the established visual harmony of the community. He was too colorful, too whimsical. He had to go. I received another $25 fine and a stern warning. This was the work of Brenda, the HOA president. I hadn't met her formally, but I'd seen her. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, bird-like features, a helmet of blonde hair that could deflect small arms fire, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pastel polo shirts and khaki slacks. She didn't walk. She patrolled, making her rounds in a silent electric golf cart she called the Compliance Cruiser. She'd glide down the street, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every lawn, every mailbox, every roof shingle for the slightest hint of nonconformity. Our first real interaction was, of course, about my lawn. I was enjoying a Saturday morning coffee on my porch when her golf cart hissed to a stop at my curb. She disembarked with the grim determination of a bomb squad technician. "Good morning," she chirped, the sound utterly devoid of warmth. "Morning," I said. She didn't reply. Instead, she produced a small metal ruler from her pocket, knelt down with a grunt, and began measuring the height of my grass near the sidewalk. After a few moments of intense study, she stood up, brushing her hands off. 3¼ inches, she announced, as if diagnosing a terminal illness. Bylaw 904A is quite clear, Alex. Maximum grass height is 3 inches. This is a formal verbal warning. I'll expect it to be rectified by 5 p.m. My brain short-circuited. I had 1,000 sarcastic replies lined up. Was she going to cite me for excessive photosynthesis? Did she want to check my tire pressure for non-compliance, too? But I was still in embrace the boring mode. So I just nodded. "You got it, Brenda. I'll get right on it." She gave a curt, satisfied nod and zipped away in her cruiser, off to terrorize some other homeowner for a misplaced welcome mat. It was then I realized Maple Creek wasn't just boring. It was an open-air prison camp for the aggressively normal, and Brenda was its warden. The one saving grace of the neighborhood was my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. She was a sweet, 80-year-old widow who had lived in her house since before the HOA even existed, back when people could paint their doors whatever color they wanted. She was a living piece of history, a relic of a time before beige conformity. She'd often bring me a plate of still-warm chocolate chip cookies and tell me stories about the neighborhood. "Oh, this place used to have character," she told me one afternoon, her eyes twinkling. "The Millers over there used to put up 100 plastic flamingos every summer. Drove some of the newer folks nuts, but it was fun." Now Brenda would have an aneurysm. Mrs. Higgins was the heart of the community, a reminder that underneath the thick crust of rules and regulations, there were actual human beings. She was kind, she was funny, and she made the best cookies I'd ever had. She was the only reason I hadn't put my house back on the market after the gnome incident. And she was the reason my quiet, boring life was about to go spectacularly off the rails. It was a Tuesday. The kind of aggressively pleasant late summer Tuesday that suburban dreams are made of. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, and the air had that first, faint hint of autumn in it. I was in the backyard, engaged in a deeply spiritual battle with a flat-pack gas grill. The instruction manual, written in what I could only assume was a pidgin dialect of Martian, showed a diagram with 16 identical-looking bolts and one smiling, polo-shirted man who had clearly not assembled this thing himself. I was on my knees, trying to attach the left-side condiment tray without stripping a screw, when I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, just a faint, sharp cry from next door. "Oh, oh dear." I paused, a tiny hex wrench clutched in my hand. Maybe she just dropped something. I waited. Then I heard it again, weaker this time. "Help, please." The hex wrench clattered onto the patio stones. I vaulted my own low fence, a fence I had recently been cited for having decorative post caps that were half an inch too tall, and sprinted across Mrs. Higgins' lawn. Her back door was unlocked. "Mrs. Higgins?" I called out, pushing it open. "It's Alex from next door." I found her in the living room, crumpled on the floor beside her favorite armchair. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was conscious, but her eyes were wide with fear. One hand was pressed tight against her chest. "Alex," she rasped, "my heart, it's doing a funny little dance." My blood ran cold. The half-assembled grill, the HOA, the beige houses, all of it evaporated. My mind snapped back into the clear, cold logic of my old life. Problem, variable, solution. Okay, Mrs. Higgins, don't move. I'm calling for help right now. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my voice steady and calm as I gave the dispatcher the address and details. Elderly female, conscious, reporting severe chest pains and shortness of breath. Suspected cardiac event. The dispatcher was a pro. She told me to stay on the line, that an ambulance was being dispatched and was only 5 minutes out. I knelt by Mrs. Higgins, holding her hand, telling her stupid stories about my startup days, anything to keep her mind off the funny little dance in her chest. 4 minutes later, I heard the blessed sound of a siren wailing in the distance, growing closer. "They're almost here, Mrs. Higgins," I said, squeezing her hand. "Almost here." The siren cut off abruptly as the ambulance turned onto our street. Maple Drive. I could see the flashing lights through her front window. Relief washed over me, and then I heard the screech of tires. Not a crash, but a sudden, angry stop. It was too soon. They should have been pulling into the cul-de-sac. "Stay right here," I told her, though she wasn't going anywhere. I ran to the front door and looked out, and my blood, which had been running cold, started to boil. The ambulance was stopped at the entrance to Cobblestone Court, the little 6-house loop we lived on, and blocking its path, parked perfectly sideways across the narrow road, was a familiar white golf cart, Brenda's compliance cruiser. Brenda herself stood beside it, arms crossed, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. I burst out of the house and sprinted across my lawn. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, were already out of the ambulance and confronting her. Their faces were etched with a combination of disbelief and fury. "Ma'am, for the last time," the male paramedic said, his voice tight with forced patience. "We have a medical emergency. You need to move your vehicle, now." Brenda did not look intimidated. She looked invigorated. This was her moment. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness, "but I cannot do that. Article 4, Section B, Subsection 9 of the Maple Creek Bylaws explicitly forbids commercial vehicles weighing over 6,000 pounds from using the decorative cobblestone entrance on weekdays between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. It's for structural integrity." I skidded to a stop next to them, breathing hard. "Are you insane?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "My neighbor is having a heart attack. There is a woman in that house who could be dying." Brenda turned her gaze on me. It was cold and flat. "Alex, your penchant for drama is noted. However, rules are the bedrock of a harmonious community. The integrity of the cobblestones is paramount to our property values. They are imported Italian pavers." The female paramedic threw her hands up in the air. "There's a woman's life at stake. We don't give a damn about your pavers." "There is an approved service entrance," Brenda countered, pointing vaguely down the street. "It's asphalt. It's designed for heavy vehicles. They are more than welcome to use it." The male paramedic's jaw was working. "The service entrance is on the other side of the block. That's a 1/4-mile detour. It'll take us another 3, maybe 4 minutes. We don't have that kind of time." "Then perhaps your company should have familiarized itself with our community guidelines before dispatching," Brenda said, actually tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "I will not have our infrastructure damaged due to your lack of planning." I just stared at her. It wasn't just that she was being stubborn. It was the look in her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated power. She was enjoying this. The rules were her weapon, and she was relishing the chance to wield them no matter the cost. Through Mrs. Higgins' window, I could see her small, pale face watching us. Her expression was one of terror. The sight shattered whatever small piece of civility I had left. The calm, logical coder was gone. The guy who just wanted a quiet, boring life was gone. Someone else had taken the controls. Brenda was about to learn that while rules might be the bedrock of her community, my spite was about to become its new foundation. I turned away from Brenda. Arguing was pointless. It was like trying to explain color to a rock. Her world was binary, compliance or violation. Humanity wasn't a variable in her equation, fine. I'd have to introduce a new one. I pulled out my phone. Brenda shot me a smug little smirk, probably assuming I was calling the police to report her. A delicious but ultimately time-wasting fantasy. I swiped to my favorites and hit the first name on the list, Dave. He picked up on the second ring. You'd better be on fire or offering me a beer. Dave was my best friend from college. While I went into the sterile world of code, he'd chased his childhood dream of flying. He was a former Army pilot who now flew a trauma helicopter for the biggest hospital in the state. We'd co-invested in a small tourism helicopter a few years back as a side hustle, which meant I had his personal number and a long history of calling in absurd favors. No fire, and I'll owe you a brewery, not a beer, I said, my voice low and urgent. You doing that trauma center run today? Just dropped off a patient, heading back to base. Why? How far out from my coordinates are you? I started walking back towards my lawn, turning my back on the pathetic little standoff at the curb. There was a pause, the sound of tapping on a screen. Looks like about 12 minutes, give or take. What's going on, Alex? You finally snap and need an evac from that suburban cult you joined? Close, I said. Change of plan. I've got a new pickup for you. My elderly neighbor is having a cardiac event, and the local HOA goblin has blocked the ambulance over some cobblestone. Another pause, this one longer. You are not serious. Deadly serious, Dave. There's a big, beautiful grass island in the middle of the cul-de-sac. It's your landing zone. Consider it hot. The natives are hostile. I texted him my exact address. Can you do it? I heard the grim smile in his voice. Alex, my friend, for a chance to piss off an HOA president? I'd fly this bird through a hurricane. ETA is now 8 minutes. I'll have my flight medics ready to roll the second we touch down. Tell the ground crew to prep the patient. Copy that. See you soon. I hung up. I walked back over to the paramedics, who were still engaged in their futile negotiations with Brenda. She was now threatening to have their ambulance towed. New plan, I announced, interrupting them. Both paramedics turned to look at me, their faces grim. Brenda just scoffed. What's your new plan, Alex? She sneered. Are you going to carry her to the ambulance yourself? Something like that, I said, checking my watch. Transport is on its way. ETA is about 7 minutes now. The female paramedic looked at me, confused. Transport? Sir, we are the transport. You're the ground crew, I said, looking up at the clear blue sky. Air support is inbound. I just stood there on my lawn, arms crossed, and waited. The seconds ticked by like hours. The male paramedic started talking into his radio, probably reporting that a civilian was having a psychotic break. Brenda was tapping her foot, radiating smugness. A few neighbors, drawn by the commotion, were peeking out of their windows. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then we heard it. It started as a faint whisper, a barely audible chopping sound that cut through the chirping of the birds. Brenda frowned, looking around. What is that noise? It grew louder. A rhythmic, bass-heavy whump, whump, whump that you felt in your teeth before you really heard it. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a plane. It was the sound of a very large, very powerful machine moving a lot of air. Every head on the street turned towards the sky. And there it was, cresting the top of the 100-foot oak trees at the end of the block. A Bell 429 medevac helicopter, shining like a ruby in the morning sun, bearing down on our quiet little cul-de-sac. Brenda's jaw went slack. The smugness on her face melted away, replaced by a gobsmacked expression of pure, uncomprehending disbelief. The helicopter circled once, a predator assessing its territory. Then it began its descent. The noise was immense, a deafening roar that shook the windows in their frames. The rotor wash hit us like a physical blow. Brenda's carefully manicured petunias flattened against the earth. The stack of violation notices on her clipboard took flight, scattering across 3 lawns in a blizzard of beige paper. She shrieked and grabbed onto her golf cart to keep from being blown over, her blonde helmet of hair finally surrendering to the chaos. With a final, ground-shaking thud, the helicopter settled perfectly in the center of the grass island. The roar subsided to a high-pitched whine. A side door slid open, and 2 flight medics in full gear hopped out, ducking under the still spinning rotors. They ran towards me, carrying a collapsible gurney. I pointed to Mrs. Higgins's house. In there, patient is an 80-year-old female, conscious, severe chest pains. They nodded and sprinted past me, joining the now mobilized ground paramedics who were rushing to the house. I turned my attention back to Brenda. She was just staring, speechless, at the multi-million-dollar piece of medical equipment currently parked on what was, technically, HOA common property. I walked over to her, leaning in close to be heard over the engine whine. "Don't worry, Brenda," I shouted with a grin. "I'm pretty sure the helicopter is under the weight limit for the grass." The extraction was a model of efficiency. The combined team of medics had Mrs. Higgins stabilized and loaded into the helicopter in under 3 minutes. As the chopper lifted off, kicking up another storm of grass clippings and righteous fury, I saw her give me a small, weak wave from the window. The roar faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by Brenda's ragged, furious breathing. That silence lasted for about 45 seconds before it was replaced by a new kind of siren. 2 police cruisers, lights flashing but sirens off, rolled quietly up the street, stopping behind the still-parked ambulance. Apparently, helicopter landing in a suburban cul-de-sac gets a slightly higher priority response than over-height grass. 2 officers got out. The senior one was a man in his 50s with a thick mustache, and the weary, seen-it-all eyes of a man who had been a cop for a very long time. His name tag read, Sergeant Miller. The younger officer looked like he'd just started shaving last week and was struggling to keep his expression neutral. Brenda, having rebooted from her stunned silence, found her voice, and it was a shriek. "Arrest him!" she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Arrest that man immediately! He is a menace! He violated FAA regulations, municipal airspace ordinances. He landed a whirlybird on common property. This is anarchy, pure, unadulterated anarchy." Sergeant Miller held up a hand, a universal gesture for, "Please calm down before you have a stroke." He looked from Brenda's apoplectic face to the paramedics, who were packing up their gear, and then to me. I was leaning casually against my mailbox, trying to project an aura of extreme reasonableness. "Okay," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Someone want to tell me what in the Sam Hill happened here? And please talk one at a time." Brenda started to launch into another tirade, but Miller fixed her with a look that could curdle milk. "Let's start with the professionals." He nodded at the ambulance crew. The male paramedic, whose name tag read Coletti, stepped forward. "Sergeant, we responded to a Priority 1 cardiac call for the resident at number 12. On arrival, this woman," he gestured to Brenda, "had used her vehicle to intentionally obstruct our access to the patient." "I was upholding our community bylaws," Brenda interjected. Miller ignored her. "Go on." "She refused to move, citing a rule about vehicle weight on the cobblestones," Coletti continued. She insisted we take a long detour that would have added several minutes to our response time. With a cardiac patient, every second counts. While we were arguing with her, this gentleman, he nodded at me, arranged for an alternative extraction. Miller's eyebrows, which were already formidable, climbed halfway up his forehead. An alternative extraction. He looked at me. Son, did you land a helicopter in the middle of the street? Technically, it was the grass island, Sergeant, I said calmly. And it was a fully licensed air ambulance flown by a certified pilot for the purposes of rendering life-saving medical aid to a person in distress, necessitated by the deliberate obstruction of conventional emergency services. I had been rehearsing that sentence in my head for the last 5 minutes. Miller stroked his mustache, a slow, deliberate motion. He looked at the divots in the grass, then back at Brenda, who was vibrating with rage. Ma'am, is this true? Did you stop an ambulance from reaching a patient? They were going to damage the pavers, she insisted. There are rules. He broke a dozen federal laws. I demand you arrest him. I decided to press my advantage. Officer, I said, adopting my most earnest tone. What's the charge for saving a life when the designated rules are actively preventing it? Is there a law against that? This was the moment, the pivot point. Miller was a creature of law and order, but he was also a human being who had probably seen enough real tragedy to recognize manufactured nonsense when he saw it. He sighed, a deep, world-weary sound. Ma'am, he said, turning his full attention to Brenda, in the eyes of the law, there's a principle called necessity. It means you can justify breaking a minor rule to prevent a much greater harm. For example, breaking the speed limit to get someone to the hospital. Or, in this highly unusual case, landing a helicopter to save someone's life because a golf cart is blocking the road. He let that sink in. There is no prosecutor in this state who would press charges against this man. However, he continued, pinning Brenda with a hard stare, obstructing emergency medical services is a crime, a serious one. So I suggest you count your lucky stars that we are not taking you downtown today. Brenda's face went through a remarkable series of colors, from furious red to a pale, blotchy white. She was utterly defeated, and she knew it. Miller turned to me. As for you, he said, his voice dropping, don't make this a habit. My paperwork is already a nightmare. We clear? Crystal, Sergeant, I said with a grateful nod. Thank you. He just grunted, tipped his hat to the paramedics, and herded his young partner back to their car. The ambulance crew gave me a thumbs up as they finally drove away, navigating carefully around Brenda's still-parked golf cart. And then it was just the two of us. The silence on the cul-de-sac was now heavy and thick with unspoken violence. Brenda's eyes, when they met mine, were no longer just angry. They were filled with a cold, hard hatred. The public humiliation had transformed her from a petty tyrant into a sworn enemy. She marched right up to me until she was standing inches from my face. She didn't shout. She spoke in a low, venomous hiss. You think you're clever, don't you? She whispered. You think you've won. I think Mrs. Higgins is on her way to the best cardiac unit in the state, I said evenly. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about it. You have no idea what you've just done, she seethed. I am going to bury you. I will read every line of the HOA covenant until my eyes bleed. I will find every single violation on your property, from the pitch of your roof to the brand of your fertilizer. I am going to fine you into bankruptcy. I will make your life here a living hell. This is my neighborhood, and you are going to regret the day you ever set foot in it. It wasn't a threat. It was a mission statement, a declaration of total war. I looked at her cold, furious face, at the perfectly manicured, soulless neighborhood behind her, and I felt a switch flip in my own head. My desire for a quiet, boring life was officially dead. She wanted a war? She had no idea who she was dealing with. I spent 10 years fighting off hostile takeover bids and corporate espionage from billion-dollar companies. This lady and her beige bylaws were small potatoes. I gave her my biggest, brightest, most infuriatingly cheerful smile. "Bring it on, Brenda," I said. "I've got time." Brenda was a woman of her word. The assault began the very next day. It wasn't a single letter. It was a deluge, a flood of certified mail that had my mail carrier looking at me with a mixture of pity and awe. Each envelope contained a new violation notice, a new fine. Apparently, the paint on my mailbox was peeling by a factor of 0.3%, a violation of the Community Aesthetic Maintenance Clause. The small oil stain on my driveway, no bigger than a quarter, violated the Surface Purity Addendum. My garden hose was coiled in a counterclockwise direction when the preferred, though not mandated method was clockwise. That one was just a warning, a sign of her magnanimity. The fines were stacking up. $25 here, $50 there. By the end of the week, I was looking at over $500 in petty, trumped-up charges. This wasn't about the money. It was about submission. She was trying to grind me down, to paper-cut me into obedience. I knew that if I fought each one individually, I'd be trapped in an endless cycle of HOA committee hearings and appeals, a bureaucratic purgatory from which there was no escape. She wanted to bog me down in the trenches. I needed to rethink the battlefield. I called a lawyer, not my old corporate guy, but a younger, hungrier attorney named Mark, whose website promised creative solutions for modern problems and featured a picture of him grinning next to a bulldog. He sounded perfect. I met him in his small, cluttered office downtown. He was in his early 30s, with a sharp suit, sharper haircut, and an energy that could power a small city. I laid the stack of violation letters on his desk. He picked one up, the one about the counterclockwise hose, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Oh, this is beautiful," he said, his eyes gleaming. "This is a work of art, the Sistine Chapel of petty tyranny. Tell me everything." I spent the next hour recounting the entire story, from the grass-measuring incident to the helicopter landing. Mark listened intently, his grin widening with every new detail. By the time I got to Brenda's declaration of war, he was leaning back in his chair, steepled fingers under his chin, looking like a predator who had just spotted a particularly juicy gazelle. "So she wants to fight you using the Covenant," he mused. "That's her weapon. She thinks she knows it better than anyone." "She probably wrote half of it," I said. "Then that's our weapon too," Mark said, pulling a massive 3-inch thick binder from a shelf. The cover read, "Maple Creek Estates, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions." He dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud. "We're not going to fight her fines. We're going to use her own rulebook to launch a counteroffensive so audacious, so completely and utterly legal, she won't know what hit her." We spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the 300-page document. It was a masterpiece of legislative insanity. There were entire pages dedicated to the acceptable species of lawn grass, the precise Pantone color of acceptable window shutters, and the maximum allowable decibel level for wind chimes. It was clear the document had been amended and added to for decades, creating a Frankenstein's monster of overlapping, often contradictory rules. "This is the key," Mark said, pointing to a passage. "Most of the really restrictive stuff, the aesthetic clauses, the color palettes, was added in the last 15 years, but the core document, the stuff about land use and major structures, that was written in 1985. As I was venting my frustration about the whole ordeal, I had the moment of inspiration. "It's all because of that damn helicopter," I grumbled, flipping through a section on fencing. She hates that I brought a helicopter into her perfect little world. I swear if I could, I'd just park one in my backyard permanently to tick her off." Mark stopped reading. He slowly looked up from the page, his eyes wide. A flicker of an idea, so wild and absurd, danced between us. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice a whisper. He started flipping through the pages frantically, his lawyerly composure gone, replaced by the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning. He stopped on a section titled Article X, Accessory Structures and Property Improvements. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "Permissible accessory structures include, but are not limited to, tool sheds, gazebos, swimming pools, and satellite dishes, provided they adhere to all relevant municipal building codes and do not exceed 20 feet in height." He looked at me, his grin returning, bigger than ever. "Alex, what do you see missing from that list?" I scanned the page. It detailed setbacks for sheds, fence requirements for pools, size limits for gazebos. It was all there, except, "There's nothing about aviation," I said, the gears in my head starting to turn. "Exactly!" Mark slammed his hand on the binder. This was written in 1985. The idea that a resident would have a private helicopter was science fiction. They have pages about bird baths, but not a single word, not one, prohibiting a private helipad. The idea bloomed in my mind. A beautiful, terrible, magnificent flower of pure spite. It was perfect. It was poetic. It was the ultimate hold my beer response to her petty tyranny. I wasn't just going to fight a fine, I was going to fundamentally and permanently alter the landscape of her beige kingdom. "Can we actually do this?" I asked, my heart starting to race. Mark's eyes shone with a maniacal glee that you really want to see in your lawyer. "Alex, it's not a question of can we. It's a question of concrete thickness. We'll have to get FAA approval, of course, and city permits. But as far as the HOA is concerned," he tapped the covenant, "according to their own sacred text, a helipad is just an unenumerated accessory structure. As long as we follow the city's rules and the HOA's setback requirements, there's not a damn thing Brenda can do to stop us." He leaned back, a beatific smile on his face. "They forgot to regulate the sky, Alex. In their obsession with the color of your front door, they forgot to regulate the damn sky." The plan was born. We wouldn't just build a helipad. We would build the most robust, over-engineered, and aggressively HOA-compliant helipad the world had ever seen. With a lawyer-approved blueprint for malicious compliance in hand, the next step was to find someone to actually build this monument to my spite. I needed a contractor. Not just any contractor, but one who understood that this wasn't just a construction project. It was a psychological operation. My first call did not go well. I looked up Maple Creek Preferred Home Builders, assuming it was best to start with someone familiar with the area. I got a man named Stan on the phone, who spoke in the hushed, reverent tones of someone who had been fully assimilated by the HOA Borg. "A pleasure to hear from you, Mr. Thompson," he said. "I've admired the tasteful taupe trim on your garage. How can I help you improve your lovely home today?" "Hi, Stan," I said. "I'm planning a backyard renovation project. I'm looking to install a concrete pad, about 50 by 50 feet, reinforced with steel rebar, with appropriate drainage and integrated grounding." "Oh, a basketball court. A fine addition," Stan said approvingly. "We use a lovely, non-glare concrete finish that is fully compliant with bylaw." "It's not a basketball court, Stan," I interrupted. "It's a helipad." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete, I thought he'd hung up. I could hear his faint, panicked breathing. A what?" he finally stammered. "A helipad, HELIPAD, for landing helicopters." "Helicopters," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Here, in Maple Creek?" "That's the plan?" "No," he whispered, his voice trembling with a primal fear. No, I can't. Brenda she would destroy me. My business is here. My family is here. I have to go. The line went dead. I sighed. Stan was a casualty of the beige tyranny, a man so thoroughly beaten down he couldn't even contemplate an act of defiance. I needed someone made of sterner stuff. I went back to Google and typed in heavy construction, concrete contractors, and no nonsense. The second result was for a company called Bedrock Beton and Steel. The logo was just a fist clenching a piece of rebar. This seemed promising. A gruff voice answered the phone with a single word. Sal. Hi, Sal. My name is Alex, I began. I have a somewhat unusual residential project. I want to install a concrete helipad in my backyard. There was a long pause. Not a scared pause like Stan's, but a thoughtful, calculating one. I could almost hear the gears turning. "To, you piss off the HOA president?" Sal asked, his voice a low rumble. A wave of relief washed over me. This was my guy. "Spectacularly," I said. "I'll be there in an hour," Sal grunted. "I love jobs with a moral imperative." An hour later, a Ford F-350 that looked like it had been used to invade a small country pulled up to my curb. Sal got out. He was a human bulldozer. He was built like a vending machine, with a bald head, a thick gray beard, and a neck that was wider than my thigh. He wore a dusty Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who could punch his way through a brick wall if the need arose. He shook my hand, his grip crushing mine effortlessly. "Sal, let's see this battlefield." I walked him to my backyard. He surveyed the pristine lawn, the neat flower beds, the placid pond in the distance behind Brenda's house. "So, the concrete slab of righteous vengeance goes here," he said, nodding. 50 by 50, standard. We'll need to go deep. 12 inches of reinforced concrete, maybe more. FAA will want specs on the load-bearing capacity. He was all business, but I could see a twinkle in his eye. He was enjoying this. "My lawyer and I found a few other interesting things in the bylaws," I said, handing him a copy of Mark's notes. "For example, any major construction project requires a privacy fence." Sal read the note, and a slow, wicked grin spread across his face. "It says here the maximum allowable height for a special project sound barrier is 8 feet. A standard privacy fence is only 6. "Exactly," I said. "I was thinking of something along the back property line, something to, dampen the noise for my neighbors." "Especially the neighbor right behind you?" he asked, pointing directly at Brenda's house, which had a perfect, unobstructed view of my backyard and the pond beyond it. "Especially that neighbor," I confirmed. "We can do a precast concrete wall," Sal said, his voice filled with artistic passion. 8 feet high, a foot thick. Nothing gets through that. Sound, light, prying eyes. Nothing. It'll be like her house just ends at the wall. A beautiful, brutalist masterpiece of spite. We spent the next hour walking the property, scheming like a pair of supervillains. Every detail was meticulously planned for maximum legal compliance and maximum psychological damage. The construction trucks would adhere to the strictest operating hours, but would be the loudest, most diesel-belching models available. We'd install landing lights, as required by the FAA, that were high intensity and aimed in a way that would probably illuminate Brenda's bedroom window. The drainage for the helipad would require a French drain system that involved digging a very large, very noisy trench right along the property line. By the time Sal left, we had a complete plan of attack. He was going to handle the permits with the city and the FAA, a mountain of paperwork he seemed to relish as part of the challenge. My job was simple: sit back, pay the bills, and prepare for the storm. "You know," Sal said as he got back into his truck, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've built foundations for skyscrapers. I've poured concrete for bridges. But this—" He looked back at my quiet, suburban house, a grin splitting his face. "This is the job I'm going to tell my grandkids about." The war began on a Monday morning at 7:01 a.m., 1 minute after the legally permitted start time for construction noise in Maple Creek. The opening salvo was not a gunshot, but the deafening roar of a diesel engine as a massive Caterpillar excavator rumbled down our quiet street. Its metal tracks chewed up the pristine asphalt, leaving marks like angry scars. It was followed by a procession of dump trucks and a flatbed carrying a portable toilet, which Sal's crew placed with malicious precision at the end of my driveway, directly in Brenda's line of sight from her front window. I was on my porch with a large mug of coffee, watching the show. It was better than television. Brenda appeared moments later, clad in a pink polo shirt and a look of absolute fury. She marched into the street, holding up her hand like a traffic cop, and stood directly in the path of the excavator. The operator, a massive man with a handlebar mustache, simply laid on the air horn. The sound, a gut-shaking blast that probably violated a dozen noise ordinances, echoed through the cul-de-sac. Birds scattered from the trees. A small dog started yapping hysterically. Brenda, to her credit, stood her ground for a solid 10 seconds before flinching and scurrying out of the way as the machine crawled past her and onto my lawn. That was just the first day. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in escalating passive aggression, a beautiful montage of suburban warfare. Brenda's first tactic was to try and block the cement mixers. She parked her compliance cruiser sideways across the street, just as she had with the ambulance. The first driver, following Sal's explicit instructions, didn't even slow down. He just leaned on the truck's deafening air horn. The sheer size and noise of a 10-ton rotating drum of wet concrete bearing down on you is a powerful motivator. Brenda's nerve broke. She peeled out of the way, her electric cart whining in protest. She never tried that again. Her next move was to call the authorities. On day 3, a harried-looking city code inspector showed up, his car dwarfed by a rebar delivery truck. Brenda was at his side instantly, clipboard in hand, pointing at the growing sea of mud and machinery that was once my backyard. "This is a flagrant violation," she declared. "The noise, the filth. He doesn't have the proper permits for this industrial zone." The inspector sighed and walked over to me. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your permits for this project." I smiled and handed him the binder Mark and Sal had prepared. It was a 3-inch thick behemoth containing every city, state, and federal permit required, all signed, stamped, and in triplicate. There were soil reports, engineering diagrams, FAA airspace declarations, and noise abatement plans. The inspector spent 20 minutes flipping through it, his expression shifting from annoyed to impressed. He finally closed the binder and handed it back to me. He turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, his paperwork is immaculate. As far as the city is concerned, he could build a nuclear silo back here if he wanted to. There's nothing I can do." Brenda's face crumpled. But the noise—" "It's within the legal decibel limit for daytime construction," the inspector said, already walking back to his car. "Have a nice day." Her final gambit was to try and turn the neighborhood against me. A schism formed in Maple Creek. The residents were divided into 2 camps. Team Brenda, comprised mostly of older sticklers for the rules who saw my project as an affront to their way of life, and Team Alex, made up of younger families who had also been terrorized by Brenda's reign and saw me as a folk hero. The community mailbox became a demilitarized zone where tense, whispered arguments took place. One afternoon, a neighbor named Gary, a staunch Brenda loyalist, confronted me while I was getting my mail. "You're destroying this neighborhood," he hissed. Our property values are going to plummet." Before I could respond, another neighbor, a quiet ER nurse named Sarah, stepped in. "He's the one who got an ambulance for Mrs. Higgins when your HOA president tried to let her die over some cobblestones," she said, her voice sharp. "I'll take a helicopter over that any day." Gary turned red and stormed off. Throughout it all, I remained Brenda's calm, smiling tormentor. I made a point to sit on my porch every morning and every evening, sipping a drink, waving cheerfully every time she passed in her golf cart. I answered her daily screamed questions about the project with infuriatingly pleasant, legally precise answers. "When will this monstrosity be finished?" she'd shriek from the street. "According to the project timeline filed with the city, Sal estimates another week, Brenda, weather permitting, of course," I'd call back with a grin. The most glorious moment came when the concrete wall went up. An enormous crane lifted the massive 8-foot-tall slabs of precast concrete into place. One by one, they slotted together, forming a seamless, impenetrable barrier of gray. It completely, irrevocably obliterated the serene pond view from Brenda's back patio. The day it was finished, I saw her standing there, just staring at the blank, brutalist wall where a beautiful vista used to be. She didn't yell, she didn't scream, she just stood there, defeated. For the first time, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The day the last construction truck rolled away, an unfamiliar quiet settled over the cul-de-sac. The war was over, and the result was permanently etched into the landscape. My backyard was gone. In its place was a 50 by 50-foot slab of reinforced concrete, a brutalist masterpiece of engineering and spite. A giant white H was painted in its center. The 8-foot concrete wall stood like a fortress battlement, and the new, industrial-grade landing lights gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was the most beautiful, hideous thing I had ever seen. To celebrate, I decided to host a party. An inaugural landing and neighborhood BBQ. I sent out invitations to everyone on the block, printed on cardstock featuring a tasteful silhouette of a helicopter. At the bottom, in fine print, it read, "All are welcome, even Brenda." I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. She had to see the final chapter of my madness for herself, probably hoping for some last-minute divine intervention or a catastrophic failure she could pin on me. The day of the party, my backyard was filled with a strange mix of people. On one side of the patio, my allies, Sarah the nurse, a few other younger couples, and Sal and his construction crew, whom I'd invited as guests of honor, were drinking beer and laughing. On the other side, clustered together like nervous sheep, were Brenda's disciples, whispering and casting dirty looks at the helipad. And then there was Brenda herself, standing by the new concrete wall, a glass of iced tea clutched in her hand, her face a thundercloud of resentment. At 4 o'clock sharp, a familiar sound began to build in the distance, a low whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that cut through the party chatter. A hush fell over the crowd. Every head turned to the sky. It was Dave, of course, flying the same crimson and white medevac helicopter. He wasn't on an official run. He'd taken the afternoon off and was flying my smaller, co-owned chopper, which we'd had painted in the same heroic colors for dramatic effect. He did a low, triumphant pass over the neighborhood, a gesture that was equal parts greeting and victory lap. Then he banked sharply and began his final approach. The landing was a thing of beauty. He brought the chopper down with a surgeon's precision, its skids kissing the concrete of the H so gently it barely made a sound. The rotor wash was immense, but my new 8-foot wall did its job perfectly, shielding the party from the worst of the blast. On Brenda's side of the wall, I could only imagine the hurricane tearing through her prize-winning rose bushes. Dave cut the engine, and as the rotors spun down, a smattering of applause broke out from my side of the yard. The side door slid open, and Dave hopped out, wearing aviator sunglasses and a grin a mile wide. He walked over to me and handed me a six-pack of craft beer. "Housewarming gift," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Figured you had a place to park this now." Just then, the back door of my house opened. Mrs. Higgins, looking healthier and happier than I had ever seen her, walked out onto the patio carrying a huge plate of her famous chocolate chip cookies. She had been discharged from the hospital a week earlier, and I'd insisted on being the one to drive her home. She walked straight to me, ignoring everyone else, and gave me a long, warm hug. "Thank you, Alex," she whispered in my ear. "For everything." That was it. That was the moment of victory. It wasn't the helicopter. It wasn't the concrete. It was the sight of Mrs. Higgins, safe and sound, and the genuine applause from the half of the neighborhood that still had a soul. I looked over at Brenda. The war was over, and she had lost. The landing, the party, Mrs. Higgins' recovery. It was a public and undeniable repudiation of everything she stood for. She looked at the helicopter parked in my yard. She looked at the smiling faces of her neighbors. She looked at the monolithic concrete wall that had stolen her view. Without a word, she set her iced tea down on a table, turned, and walked away, disappearing into her house. We didn't see her for the rest of the evening. Later that night, long after the guests had gone home, I was sitting in a lounge chair on my patio. The party lights were off, and the only illumination came from the moon, which reflected off the pale gray surface of the helipad. It was quiet. The kind of deep, satisfying quiet I had been looking for when I first moved here. I took a sip of my beer and reflected on the absurdity of the last few months. I came to Maple Creek Estates seeking a boring, peaceful life. I hadn't found it. The neighborhood was a snake pit of petty rules and beige conformity. But in fighting back, in going to war with its self-appointed queen, I had found something better than peace. I had found purpose, and I had, in my own loud, expensive, and frankly ridiculous way, made the neighborhood a slightly better place to live. A quiet had fallen. My quiet. Earned, not given. I leaned back, looking at the massive, empty slab of concrete dominating my yard, and a single, happy thought drifted through my mind. I wonder if the bylaws say anything about getting a tank.